a lot of times people talk about and think about curiosity like it's a muscle that you develop and flex and you get better at it and stronger and it's more fluid. And I think that metaphor is bad. And I don't think it's true. I think that curiosity is actually a choice. It's a switch that you just flip on.
What are the secrets that drive the businesses you love or nonprofits you admire? Join us as we uncover the surprising ideas at the intersection of causes and brands. I'm Dave Raley.
And I'm Berna. Each episode, learn from leaders of nonprofits and companies that will give you insights that you can put into action. This is the Purpose and Profit Podcast.
Is your organization facing a leadership transition? Faith Search Partners specializes in faith-based executive search with a 98% success rate. Visit faithsearchpartners.com. Welcome to the show today. It brings me great joy to introduce our speaker, Chad Littlefield, co-founder of We and Me. Forbes calls Chad a global expert on asking questions that build trust and connection. He's a TEDx speaker, best-selling author, and the creator of the We Connect cards, a tool now being used in over 80 countries to create conversations that matter. Chad and his company's late co-founder, Will Wise, wrote the book, Ask Powerful Questions, which is consistently a #1 best-selling book on Amazon in more than 4 categories. Now, if you want your kids or grandkids to think you're cool, tell them that you met a real-life YouTuber. Chad has a library of over 500 videos that have earned millions of views. And each one is designed to help leaders make connection and engagement easy. I can attest to that. I've seen maybe not 500, but quite a few of those. And Chad has brought workshops and ideas and interactive keynotes to companies like Crayola, JetBlue, Johnson & Johnson, Starbucks, and dozens of top universities, even the CIA. Welcome, Chad. Good to have you here.
Hey, lovely to be here.
We had a guest recently that was like, why do I have to be here for my bio read? Can you do that separately? But I love your bio read. It's great.
It's the only part that I'm going to send to my mom. She's the one that cares most probably about a bio, right?
No, it's super helpful. And by the way, fun fact, the reason we're talking today is because of the book, Ask Powerful Questions. And I reached out to a friend of mine who I really respect, another author, somebody who I always have admired how he asks questions, when sometimes I feel like I make a lot more declarations and statements and not ask questions. And he said, well, you need to read this book, Ask Powerful Questions. So thank you, Chad and Will.
Lovely. Thank you to this person who recommended it.
Yeah.
This mystery person.
Russell, if you're listening today.
Russell.
Thank you for the recommendation. Now, Chad, before we really dive into questions, just talk about how do you get into this work? Why is connection so important to you? And just, what draws you to this? What drives you there?
Yeah, I'll tell you the beginning of the story and the end of the story, or the present of the story, maybe. So the beginning of the story, when I was half the height that I am now, I had seen the movie Patch Adams with Robin Williams, which at this point is like ancient history. It came out like 1995 or something. In the movie, basically, Robin Williams becomes a doctor to promote the quality of life over quantity. And he just had this like really, in my opinion, beautiful way of healing and connecting with patients who otherwise, we're having a really difficult time. So one of my favorite scenes, there was this terminally ill patient, and no nurses, none of the best clinicians or doctors could get this guy to eat. And Patch walked into his room and just looked at him right in the eyes and said, "Kick the bucket, push the daisies," and started going back and forth, on idioms around death, which is like not going to find that technique in a medical textbook, like not a recommended strategy, but he just had this deep empathy to know, like, this guy doesn't want to put on a smile, like he's on it. And so, Point is, I was just really struck in that movie, and so I had my whole life figured out. I was like, I'm going to be a doctor. I'm going to be Patch Adams, thinking maybe pediatrician. And then I took a chemistry class in college, and was like, okay, never mind, this isn't going to work out. Time to switch plans. And I was still committed to being Patch Adams. I just didn't want to go to school for 10 years to hold a scalpel. And so I really started studying and figuring out like how much of that was Hollywood versus what is the impact of connection, and what happens when you do it really well in an organizational context. And so I studied experiential learning and learning design and interpersonal psychology, and just soaked up from all these different disciplines and kind of mashed them together. And the too long didn't read save you 5 years is, it turns out that connection has a really profound impact. It can actually reduce medical errors and deaths that happen amongst surgical teams if you do connection and connection before content really well. It changes the way that students feel in your classroom in a way that at the end of a lesson, they actually raise their hands and participate rather than you becoming a dentist and pulling teeth. And there are all these impacts across disciplines. And so, continue fast forwarding. I just got really clear that I exist on the planet to gently eradicate small talk and create conversations that matter. And so one of the ways that I did that 10 years ago was created this little teeny deck of cards, had 60 questions on them. I created the deck for myself. They didn't have a name. I didn't plan on making a second deck. I just created them for a group that I was facilitating that day. And they worked. They were really cool. They made that less awkward. And now that deck has been shipped 100,000 times all over the world and is being used in companies and organizations. And I had no intentions of it going beyond that single use. But that kind of brings me to where I'm at today.
Yeah, we love that your work revolves around this idea of connections. And our listeners work for both nonprofits and for-profit. So I wanted to ask you, when you think about connections, how would it apply to either area or both? Do you see it being different? Do you see it being similar? How could they take this idea of connections and apply it?
Yeah, I will answer that in a fun story that happened just a day or two ago. So I wish I could show everybody the picture. My friend captured a picture of me wading into this creek at a park with my 4-year-old, Otto. And the picture he took had a big sign in the foreground that said, "No wading in the creek." And we're sitting there with our pants rolled up, wading in the creek. And I think that sign wasn't effective because it was not personalized to me. It didn't answer it didn't include any currency that I cared about. If it said, "No wading in the creek because this is a chemical dump site," probably wouldn't have waded in the creek. Even more, if it said, my 4-year-old broke his arm on the monkey bars a few weeks ago. And so we're wading in a creek, and he ended up falling in the creek, soaking his cast, which turned out to be a lovely $800 medical exchange. And so if the sign said, "No wading in the creek because your 4-year-old might trip over a rock, soak his cast, and cost you $800, I definitely wouldn't have gone in the creek. And so this brings me to the idea, one of the core tenets or ideas of my work, which is being really clear about intention. And so if you're going to connect with anybody, whether it's in a nonprofit or a business space, the more personalized the intention, the more personalized the communication, the better it's received. And so if a corporation is pushing out and trying to connect with customers by saying, "Look at how awesome we are," guess what? Customers don't really care about that. But if they're communicating and saying, "Look at this very specific problem that only you have, and we really know you," then they might care a little bit more. And so it's that personalization. It's the same way that when Patch walked into a terminally ill patient's room, he just had the empathy, knew how to connect and reach that person. And so it's, for me, at the core, it's just bringing the humanity back in. It's paying attention to what currency do people care about, what matters to people. And sometimes you have to ask in order to know any of that information.
Yeah. And I think on the nonprofit side, if you have donors, you need to create connections with them, especially because you're usually asking them for money, to their face, and so there has to be some great level of connection to be able to do that.
I've worked with a bunch of donor groups. One of the conferences I spoke at last year was a case summit. So it was like the heads of advancement and fundraising for all major universities around the country. And it's like, oh, I've hung out with like clients. I've been, I was out at lunch with the CEO of a 2,000 person company, and she was sharing just how many templated letters she gets asking for money, being asked for money. And just the ability to really know what matters to somebody, if it's that they really want the name on a building, or that their granddaughter has this rare disease and they just want to like cure that disease for everybody. Like that would change the letter, that would change the number, that would change the amount of zeros in the donation. There'd be a lot of impact if you're able. Now, obviously, that's not quite as scalable to know everybody's super personal history. And so that's where connection comes in.
Yeah, I think about, some of the lessons I feel like I've learned in connection before content is from my wife. She's a middle school educator. By the way, also wanted to be a doctor. Patch Adams took anatomy and was like, get me out of here. I want to help the person, not their body, and so I can relate. But, it's just, there's something about when people feel like, it seems like safe and like they belong in some sense, right? That the receptivity to information or influence or whatever you're trying to do is higher. Is that right?
Yeah, 100%. So you're right. You say your wife is a middle school teacher. Yep. Okay, so my wife was, not anymore, but was a school nurse in a middle school. Okay. So when your wife's kids got sick, she sent them to my wife's office. And one of the stories that I really, really love, that Kate came home one day and shared that she had this regular med kid who every day had to take his probably Adderall, which you'll learn based on the story, or something like that. And she always knew he was coming because from way down the hallway, she could hear like heavy breathing. So she'd hear, and this kid, we'll call him Mikey for HIPAA's sake, like would blast in her door, sprawl out, lay on the floor. And every single day he'd go, okay, Nurse Kate, I'm ready for my question. And Kate kept a deck, maybe because she's guilty because she's married to me, kept a deck of these We Connect cards on her desk. And her regular med kids knew that assuming there was no anaphylactic reaction happening, that they got to choose a question to answer, and they got to choose a question for her to answer. And so I believe, or I choose to interpret that story, that Mikey was actually running to Kate's office, not to get the meds, right? He was running because it was his 5 minutes that day of really being seen, heard, and understood. Whereas, I don't know about your wife, but the rest of his teachers are probably saying, Mikey, shh, Mikey, stop talking. Mikey, stop fidgeting. Mikey, stop, right? And so just to have that moment, and I think the metaphor of when we connect before content really well, whether you're in a nonprofit or a for-profit space, you create the space where people are actually metaphorically running into work. They're happy to be there. They feel comfortable there. It's their time to either do what they love, work with people they love. And connection before content helps that along quite a bit, which at some point we should probably define what that is.
Yeah. Why don't we do that? What is connection before content?
To me and to Peter Block, who I first learned it from, it's got to have this checklist of 3 ingredients. So it is whatever you do that allows people to connect to each other. So if you're a teacher, it's not just about building rapport with students, or if you're the executive director at a nonprofit, it's not just about connecting you and yourself and building rapport with staff, but it's actually connecting staff to each other, right? So I think really great leaders assume the social risk to create connections. And what that means is, like, rather than leaving you totally up to connection by chance, as a leader, you have the power to say, hey, we're going to start this meeting, instead of how was your weekend, we're going to start this meeting with what is one thing you'd really love to stop doing this week? It's just like, whoa, this is a kind of juxtaposition. We're not used to this. It is a social risk to start off a conversation with that. And so the leader gets to assume that by leading it. So number 1, connect with each other. Number 2, and this is what any like icebreaker typically would miss, and why I advocate for replacing the term icebreaker with connection before content, is ingredient number 2 is got to connect people to the purpose of why they are there. Right? I worked with a group of 1,000 engineers a few weeks ago, and you say the word icebreaker to them, and 50% of them break out in hives. But if you say, hey, this meeting is really expensive, there's a lot of us here right now, it is a waste of time for me to just start talking about the content. We have to have 500 meetings all at once to maximize our time. So for 5 minutes, I'm going to throw out a question that connects to why we're actually here. And I'd love for you to just connect with one other person over that before coming back into the larger group, right? And so we're going to essentially 500x our time, our return on time here. And the question is, and I don't remember what I asked them, but it ideally revolves around purpose. So if your purpose is to review quarterly numbers or talk about a rebrand or anything else like that, your question might be, what is a past rebrand that you've been a part of or experienced that went really well? Right. So the connection before content is like brings in their personal expertise and life experience, but also blends it with why they're actually there, which uncrosses a lot of arms right at the beginning. And then last but not least, ingredient number 3 is it's got to create at least the space for and choice for authenticity or vulnerability, which for me is just does it give people a chance to share a piece of their truth? And any good question, any good prompt has many, many answers to it, right? So it's like, what is one of your favorite stories about a rebrand? There might be 3 different answers to that question, and you get to pick. So there's the autonomy and choice to share something that's real, but also at a level of depth of your choosing.
Yeah.
What do you see as some of the biggest barriers to having meaningful conversations? Like, you talked at the beginning, I love when you said your purpose is to eliminate small talk. I personally hate small talk, so therefore I don't talk. But I'm sure there's other barriers too, but what do you see are the biggest barriers and how can you overcome those?
It's a beautiful question. When anybody I've ever met walks into a wedding, I haven't met anybody that walks in to the ballroom and says, ooh, who do I know least in this room? And then walk toward them. It is whatever that part of our DNA and human psyche is, whatever that, the seek of comfort is the same barrier that prevents us from asking a different question. And so it keeps us locked into, and I've asked in person, I've asked over 100,000 people, what questions do you typically ask when you meet a new person? And every audience across every culture, anywhere around the world will say, where are you from? What do you do? Maybe do you have any kids? How are you? What's your name? And after 5, big groups slow down to an absolute halt. And then maybe the class clown says, are you married? As the sixth question. But for the most part, right, as humans, we've stuck to this core questions. And so to overcome and get outside of that, which for me is where being really clear about intent comes in. And so the way to overcome that barrier for me is to get really clear about an other-centric intention. So, hey, I'm Carly. I hate small talk, right? So if I'm you, first of all, I think the choice to not talk is not always bad. So cool, right? It's sometimes an economy of words is lovely. But if you want to talk, if you want to have a conversation, that you want to create a conversation that matters, I have done things, and there is social risk in embedded in breaking any norm, right? So that just disclaimer, there is a social risk. I think it is quite low, but the perceived risk is a bit higher. So let's take this, for example. You sit down at I don't have a question around here. If you sat down at a bus stop and I gave you the task of asking the person next to you, what is one thing life is teaching you right now? It's ooh, you sit down at a bus stop and ask somebody that question, you're going to get some cringes.
Big question.
That interaction likely is not going to build a relationship of trust, right? And they might decide to take the next bus. If you had to, though, so I'm not saying you have to or not, and I'm not saying you should, but if you had to ask somebody that question, I would suggest sitting down at a bus stop and saying, hey, I'm Carly. Recognize this is a bit odd, but I'm actually just kind of stretching myself to create conversations that go beyond just pointless small talk. Are you game if I ask you kind of a big question? They might absolutely say no at a bus stop, right? But you've given them the choice. By sharing your intention, you've offered them the opportunity to consent to having a conversation that matters or not. And so in a much less threatening setting, like at work or a conference or a networking event or anything else, just to say, hey, I recognize that probably right now I'm supposed to ask you what you do, but I'm finding myself really naturally curious. What's your story and how'd you get into your work? I think you could get away with that, right? When you're sharing a really clear intent, it's rooted in your curiosity. The phrase, I'm just curious, is quite disarming in a lot of ways. Does that answer your question?
Yes, definitely. Especially for those of us who hate small talk.
Yeah.
Well,
I'm in the camp.
Just a plug for the book. There are some things about that really helped me. I'm a pretty strong introvert. But one of the things, for example, I remember was talked about was just the idea of being curious. We do a lot of Zoom meetings, right? And so it's like, I'm curious about your background or, something that piques our curiosity. And as a fairly strong introvert myself, I used to feel that was like a risky thing to do. Like, but what if, like step on some toes or whatever. It's like, well, number one, it's in their background. That's probably fair game. But two, it's just can open up people's, connection, willing to dialogue.
Yeah. And you're kind of jumping to chapter 2 of the book, which unpacks this idea of specifically following your curiosity. If you're building a connection from scratch, specifically following your curiosity based on something that somebody is wearing, carrying with them, sharing verbally or in their body language, tends to be a relatively safe way to access who somebody is, not just some surface level thing about them, right? So if I put on a t-shirt that says AC/DC, first of all, if you're seeing me, I'm probably out in public. And so I knew I was going to go out in public that day, and I chose to put this on my body. And so I actually have already started a conversation. Yeah. It just didn't involve words. It involved my t-shirt. And so by me asking you, hey, I'm curious, what's your connection to AC/DC? That is like a teleportation shortcut into something that they really care about, most likely. Whereas if you just walked up to somebody and say, hi, I'm curious, what is something you really care about? It's like totally out of context. It's not in the present visual sphere, so to speak, or the contextual, like environmental sphere. Yeah. The other thing, though, that I don't know that the book unpacks is that the reason that I think the strategy is so low risk is I have not met anybody on the planet who doesn't have a desire to be seen, heard, and understood at some level. I just, if you meet somebody, send them my way. I'll be super curious. Even people that might present as screw you, screw the world, still haven't met anybody that doesn't at some level have a desire to be seen, heard, or understood. And so when you're curious, you kind of dip your toe into that space and say, like, cool if I just see like a little piece of who you are. Is that all right? And oftentimes it turns into something really lovely. Yeah,
I love it. And there's just so many sort of aspects to that. I think for people who feel like, okay, maybe connection doesn't come as naturally for them, right? And that can be super helpful. So Chad, as you do your work, you're all about enhancing dialogue and collaboration. Can you share one of your favorite stories from either nonprofit or for-profit context where you feel like it really improved outcomes?
Yeah. I think the story it's about a for-profit context, but it spans both of them like totally equally well. And it was at a conference, and I actually met this guy who owned a pizza shop chain. And he told me that he had a 0% employee turnover rate on an annual basis, which if you know anything about the food service industry, like for a kind of fast foodish pizza chain, that is ridiculous, right? Like you're trying to keep people for a few months, never mind all of them for more than a year. And so naturally I asked him, like, dude, what are you doing to get 100% employee retention rate? And he said, honestly, I boil it all down to this. whenever somebody comes into the company, whoever's onboarding them is trained to sit down and say, hey, thank you. We really need your help at this pizza shop. Before we get into like dough, powder, cash registers, things like that, we recognize that you might not work at this pizza shop forever. And so what we'd love to do, if you're game, we'd love for your time at the pizza shop to be a stepping stone to where you really want to go. And so what is it that you're after? Where do you want to go in the next few years, 5 years, et cetera? And if you don't have an answer to that, if people don't have an answer to that, they invite them to go come up with an answer to that and bring it back. And then the pizza shop actually works with them to work that out. And so if they wanted to go to night school to become a nurse practitioner and classes are on Wednesdays, they're pretty committed to figuring out and juggling schedules so that this person doesn't have to work on Wednesday nights. And so people stay there because they're there for a stepping stone for a few years, which is like a super compelling, really easy strategy that I would put in the category of like connection before content in an onboarding kind of space, or as you're welcoming somebody in. But I'll add one little add on there, which is if you're not onboarding anybody, to every leader, I would ask, do you know where your people want to go in the next handful of years? What do they care about? Where do they want to go? Because if you cannot answer that, it's really hard to frame their work and speak in a currency that matters to them. If you don't know what people care about, how are you supposed to personalize your intention? How are you supposed to walk into the waiting room or the room of a terminally ill patient and know how to get them to eat and to get them to respond? Yeah.
You know, I would have loved to seen the alternate universe of your life where you did get to become a doctor and how you applied this with patients. Like, I'm just imagining that.
Yeah. I don't know if I should share the story on a podcast. I'll do it very quickly because I am a patient often enough, right? So it's like the same method applied back to healthcare. I was in college and I had some weird like back spasm or injury that was so bad that I crawled down a stairwell onto a sidewalk and called a cab and like crawled myself into a cab to get taken to the student health center. I couldn't stand up and walk. It was just, it was bad. So I got there and they went to give me a steroid shot to like stop or hopefully relax, muscle relaxer, steroid, something to relax the muscle and stop the pain cycle. And so they were given the shot in my butt. And so they pulled down my pants. I turned around and said, nice buns, huh? I was in like excruciating pain, like swearing under my breath. And the nurse, whose name was Barbie, this is totally like HIPAA violation, like found my contact info after I left and reached out and said, hey, I just really liked your personality. I'm having this roller derby tournament next week. Will you come like MC the roller derby? And it was like in college, like I hadn't started business, like going off and speaking, just like, yeah, absolutely ridiculous. So
that's
hilarious. I don't think I would have made it as a doctor very well, to be honest. I would have seen like one patient the whole day and then the waiting room would have backed up.
Yeah. That's funny. You know, as you're talking, I'm thinking a lot about just my own work and what others who are listening might have experienced in the past 5 years, which is this remote work environment. And in the different organizations I've worked for, it's always been a challenge to try to connect over Zoom or whatever thing we're using. So what have you had to recommend or even just learned yourself in the last 5 years of how to increase that connection? Because, you know, when you're in person, when a meeting ends, you kind of linger and talk to each other and whatever. But when you're on Zoom, it's like the meeting ends and it's just like goodbye and everyone hangs up and like it's over. So that like connection point is gone. So how do you like bring that connection back?
I don't know if you know how loaded this question is in a good way. But I spent like the majority of 2020 and 2021 answering this question of like, how do we make virtual engagement really easy? And also published a book titled How to Make Virtual Engagement Easy. And so answering and unpacking this stuff. And I'm pretty committed to not like over plugging my stuff, but that just kind of fits. So here's the answer, because the answer is not go read a book. The answer is, I think that COVID and the we were working remote long before COVID, but COVID pushed the whole world to an experiment in working remotely. And I think the gift that it gave us was the awareness, not that virtual is bad or harder or whatever. It's that most of our meetings are terrible because we don't have any intention or design. We just put them on the calendar. And so for me, the same rules that apply for how to make virtual engagement easy should also apply to in-person. And so here's a couple examples. So whenever I'm designing any or hosting any session or meeting, I'm thinking about 5 particular ingredients that I'm injecting in. And we won't go through all 5 of them, but I'll go through a couple. So the first one is this idea of an unofficial start. So Zoom, maybe people are clicking like the last minute to get in, but somebody's setting up their Wi-Fi, their computer had to restart, their kids are running late, whatever's going on. So they join 5 minutes later. What do we do typically in that 5 minutes? Your least favorite activity, Carly, small talk, right? We twiddle our thumbs, ask how your weekend was, jib jab about nothing, or maybe sit there in silence, depending on the organization culture. I would suggest that infusing an unofficial start, which is a phrase I picked up from a chap named Mark Collard in Australia. The idea that as soon as you're on and there's one other person there, have a meaningful and immediate way to engage. And so for me, oftentimes I really love questions. And so it's coming in and saying, hey, we're focused right now on how to, like this meeting is about upgrading our CRM or whatever. But just as we get started here, I'm curious, what's a small way that you could improve your relationships? And you toss that, I would frame that question. I would like soften that a little bit. But as people are coming in, just saying, hey, I've got an unofficial start question for us. And this depends, right? You're not like, if you're a team of 6 and you meet 5 times a week, like this is going to be less formal. But the idea is like, come in with some intentional way to start. All you have to do to get rid of small talk is come in with an intentional way to start. That's it. Right. And then the small talk goes away. And then the second one, I'll skip to the end. So often, especially remotely, we end meetings in a rush, not having finished everything. And we go in with high cortisol levels to the next meeting. And it's such a bad, unsustainable way to go from day to day to day. And so for me, the 5th ingredient is closing. Know the last thing that you're going to say or do to invite contribution from the whole group. And so my internal team meetings, the irony of your own expertise, like sometimes I'm very terrible at this. And so I've got 55 ideas in my head. We get to the end. I'm like, oh, let me squeeze 3 more out. Anymore, we actually stop 5 to 10 minutes before the official end. And we just ask a question like, how are you feeling right now? Or what is the one thing that you're taking away from this meeting? Or what would you like to have done by Friday? Or whatever else. What's a question you still have? Just some debrief, some reflection, some way to like slow down and then leave with intention. And just those 2 things, beginning and end. There's lots of cool magic that happens in the middle. But the core of the idea is do not leave your virtual meetings up to chance. Design them. If you design them a little bit more, they get way less painful.
Innovation is the lifeblood of any growing organization, and that's exactly what Imago Consulting does. Imago helps nonprofits and businesses grow through innovation. They publish a weekly trends report called The Wave Report. Learn more and subscribe at imago.consulting/wave report. That's IMAGO.consulting/wave report.
Yeah, that's so good. Chad, if you think about this, we've got people listening to the show right now that are leading nonprofits, that are working in nonprofits. They're they just came from 5 meetings and they're, on the way home and they're listening to this. You've got business leaders who care deeply about causes and, that have a passion for that intersection of causes and brands. If you think about connection, communication, what is one piece of advice that you've been given or that you love to give that you think would be just just important for people to hear?
Oof. I think it would probably default to the magic of a second question. And this stems from the idea that like kids between the ages of 3 and 5 ask 300 to 400 questions per day on average. Adults tend to ask 6 to 12 questions per day on average. So our question count decreases by 95%. And so if you just like take a recording of most meetings that happen, most interactions that happen, there's just a real question deficit. And so my advice isn't to double your question count. It's not to try to increase question. It's literally just to ask a second question. So when you hear somebody speak or you've asked a question, when you hear their answer, just ask one single follow-up question. And if you do that, you will be really, really amazed at the impact of that. And I think here's why. Because sometimes people listen to a podcast, watch a YouTube video, read a book, and they're like, okay, connection before content. I got it, Chad. Thanks. And they go into their next meeting and they're like, okay, everybody, let's pick a question out of this deck here. What is something you would like to continue doing? And they hear people's response and they're just like, next, next, next. And all they did was check 6 boxes. They didn't actually hear anybody. And so when you ask a second question, it means that you're just really listening to what they had to say. And you didn't have some preconceived notion of what you were going to say afterward. You just followed up with your genuine curiosity, which is, I think, the most beautiful way of reflective listening to somebody is to ask them a follow-up question that really kind of takes another angle or accesses another level of their initial response or answer. And so that's it. If you're a leader in a for-profit, nonprofit space, tap into the magic of a second question.
That's so powerful, Chad. I think about some of the events and conferences that I go to. I literally, before I went to the last event a week or two ago, I wrote at the top of my notebook, ask questions. And it's just, again, like, especially you get into these professional environments and you're just it's cultural to make statements, right? And so just the fact that second question, I think, is really powerful.
So can I play a game with you that will be useful to listeners? Or it only takes 10 seconds.
This is great because I was going to say
it is okay.
Because then we'll go to our lightning round because we have some questions for you, Chad.
Okay, beautiful. So here's the game. I'm going to hold up a blank sheet of paper in 4 seconds. And all I want you and Carly to do is both unmute and ask questions, even if it's on over each other's voice. Ask questions as quickly as you can, rooted in your natural curiosity about this piece of paper. You ready?
Okay.
Set. Go.
How big is that paper?
It's blank.
How thick
for
is
one.
it?
Yes, I want to know what weight of
is it
paper
printer
it
paper?
is. Off-white.
And pause.
What's on the back of it?
So there you go. What we could have done, we could have gone on for another 60 seconds, right? But just there, you almost met your adult quota for question asking. And so here's just the reminder of why I wanted to play this, is that a lot of times people talk about and think about curiosity like it's a muscle that you develop and flex and you get better at it and stronger and it's more fluid. And I think that metaphor is bad. And I don't think it's true. I think that curiosity is actually a choice. It's a switch that you just flip on. And all I did was say, be curious about this piece of paper. And all of a sudden you had a bunch of questions, right? You're fully able to ask questions. Most people, because as kids, Dave and Carly, you ask 300 to 400 questions a day. Your brains know perfectly well how to ask wonderful questions. And so all you got to do is flip the switch and questions will come out. And while the book unpacks, how to ask really phenomenal questions, I'm more concerned about whether you're asking questions rooted in your curiosity or not. Sure, all questions are created equal, but a question typically is better than no question.
It's funny because we end this podcast with a lightning round, which I'm going to do right now. But unfortunately, there will be no second questions, only first questions.
We've been guilty of asking some second questions. We'll see. We'll see what he brings to the table.
Yes. Okay. So
All right. hit
Ironically,
me.
the first question I already know the answer to, but I'm going to ask it anyways, just in case you have a different answer, which is, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Patch Adams. It
Yeah.
was like always Patch Adams.
Okay. Yeah. I feel like we talked about Patch Adams enough. We got that one.
Yeah.
Okay. What is your favorite podcast?
I really like How I Built This.
That's my favorite podcast.
It's so good. Yeah.
I love that show.
So good.
Yes.
It's funny because Guy Raz, the interviewer, like, according to Ask Powerful Questions, he asks really bad questions. They're like, many of them are closed. Lots of them are leading. They often have multiple choice questions. And I think it's because he's developed the art of leading. He takes people on a journey.
Yes.
And he doesn't want them to go into like cassette mode where they plug in a tape and spit out the, a couple times in this podcast, like I told a story that I have told before.
Yeah.
And so I put in that part of my brain that turns on, and Guy has a very beautiful way of navigating around that.
Yes. I love his podcast. What book are you reading?
I've half read 2 books about ADHD. You can interpret why from there.
Well said.
I recently finished Willpower Doesn't Work, which was a really interesting take on just like not trying to curb bad behavior and instead just spend a minute designing your environment to avoid bad behavior, which I appreciated.
That's good. Okay. What show are you binging on your streaming platform of choice?
I have 2 kids under 4 right now, and I just made a commitment yesterday. Like, I'm totally done watching TV after they're in bed, because I wake up at 4:45 in the morning, and sleep has not been a non-negotiable in my past, and it now is non-negotiable. So none.
Okay.
I
No
can
show.
relate to that.
Yeah.
What app do you use the most?
I should go check that out. I don't know the answer to that, which is really interesting. I think I probably most frequently open iMessage, but total time spent, maybe not iMessage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of people say communication ones, ironically, but okay. Last question is, what refreshes and refuels you?
Ooh. Swimming. All things swimming. I wake up at 4:45 to swim. I swim with like an old people adult swim team in Pittsburgh. I've recently started swimming in the rivers of Pittsburgh, like open water, swim a couple miles with a group. I scuba dive. I really have become obsessed with free diving lately, like the art of how long you can hold your breath and how far you can swim underwater, or how deep you can swim on one breath, like all things water.
I did my first triathlon this summer, which was an open water swim. And I hate swimming. It is not a sport for me.
I'm gonna get you a T-shirt, Carly. I hate small talk and
swimming. And small talk. Yeah, you're speaking to 2 people who have very unsuccessfully swam at various points in our life. I've been a runner in the past, and it was like, whoa, this swimming thing is wild. But for people,
it's one of those things though that, like, if you spent like an hour or 2 with me in like a clinic, it would get a lot easier. It would get like you can get like 80% of swimming down in like a few hours of good instruction.
I did take 5 hours of classes.
Boy.
I got better. I just didn't enjoy it. I love biking and running. I just don't love looking at the bottoms of a lake for like 40 minutes,
Yeah. See, and I literally was just like free diving at the bottom of the river of Pittsburgh, like looking for weird artifacts in this brown, quiet world.
Yeah.
Well, I get the sense, Chad, that you like that. I don't know if it's teaching is part of your gift. I don't know what the right word is, but there's a through line with you in terms of helping people to see new ways of being and new ways of acting. And I love it. So cool.
Thank you very much. I think I'm become clear that one of the distinguishing factors or things that I spend a lot of effort on is the easy part of things. Like you can make connection really, really hard, really complex. But I like just distilling it down to like the essence for me, which for me is teaching. It's like scaffolding. If someone's just entering the world, like you want to, what's the 101 class? And that feels important.
Love it. Love it. Well, Chad, thank you for being on the show. If folks are looking for you, for where would you send them? What would you say?
Well, there was another kind of high-profile murder of a guy named Chad Littlefield. So if you Google Chad Littlefield, click the one that's alive, because I'm still kicking
alive.
it, doing well. And me. If folks want to learn from me live, I'm hosting a Connectors Summit. I host it every December. It'd be a really cool way to touch base. And then YouTube, if you search the word icebreaker or team building or connection or anything else or my name, I'm not super hard to find.
That's awesome. Well, we'll include some links to that. We also did an episode, season 4, episode 7 for our listeners, where we talked about connection before content and how, for example, I play that out in speaking. We also talked about for leadership. So if you're interested, you can check that out. And hope that our listeners today, that you learned something new, that you were challenged, that your perspective was widened, and that you can apply that to your life and leadership. Have a great day. We're grateful for our partners this season, including Virtuous, a software company committed to helping nonprofits grow generosity, Faith Search Partners, an executive search firm specifically for faith-based organizations, and Imago Consulting, an advisory firm that helps nonprofits and businesses grow through innovation. For more episodes, find us wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to subscribe so that you're always up to date. Would you do us a favor? It would be great if you would rate the show and leave us a review. Your feedback is so valuable to us. Follow the show on LinkedIn, or you can reach us at our website at purposeandprofitpodcast.com. On the site, you can also sign up for our email newsletter to get updates whenever we launch a new episode. Thanks for listening.